Was Jesus man or myth? Now, shortly before Christmas, an article appeared in a newspaper. I think it was the Daily Mail. And the person who wrote the article was arguing that Jesus never really existed. He was an invention of the Romans who invented him for political reasons. Now, while that's quite an outlandish theory that probably not many people would believe, it is actually becoming increasingly common to see people suggest that Jesus was never a real historical person. So if you go on YouTube, you can actually find a number of talks, videos by skeptics arguing that Jesus never existed. And partly these ideas have been fueled by quite famous atheists. So there's a man called Christopher Hitchens who wrote a book called God Is Not Great. And in his book he writes, "There is little or no evidence for the life of Jesus." And another atheist who will be more well known to some of you, Richard Dawkins, he also has written that it is possible to mount a serious historical case that Jesus never lived at all. So, was Jesus a real historical person, or was he just a myth? In order to explore this issue, I'm going to attempt to answer two questions tonight. The first one is, was Jesus a real historical person? And the second one is, that if he was a real person, what is the best, the most reliable source of information we have about his life? Well then, so let's look at that first question. Was Jesus a real historical person? Now, for most of history, that is something that wasn't questioned and it was just accepted. And then around about the 1800s, you had some more liberal scholars who began to question if Jesus was real. One of them, a man called Bruno Bauer, who was a German, he produced a book in which he denied Jesus really existed, and he gave 3 arguments to support his view. Now, at the time, most people ignored him and didn't take him very seriously at all, but his arguments have actually survived and generally are the ones that keep getting repeated now when people want to deny that Jesus was real. And his arguments were this. Firstly, you can't trust the Bible. He said that the Gospels in the Bible, so that's Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, he said that they were written a long time after the events that they talk about by people who wouldn't have known anything about Jesus. He also said that over time they've been altered so that now when we read them we can't even be confident that what we read is what was originally written. And he also argued that there were many different versions of Jesus' life written, and what we have in the Bible were the ones that were selected and other versions of Jesus' life were suppressed and kept hidden. So that was his first argument. You can't trust the Bible. He also said that stories that we have in the Bible about Jesus were actually all borrowed from pagan myths. None of them were original. They were all taken from pagan religions that previously existed before Christianity. And his last argument was that there are no genuine accounts of Jesus' life outside of the Bible, which is suspicious. If he was such a unique, special person, why is nobody else written about him? So those are the 3 arguments he put forward to say, therefore, Jesus never existed. He wasn't a real person, he was just a myth. And those 3 arguments basically underpin even modern skeptics like Richard Dawkins will pull out the same arguments to argue that you can put forward this case that Jesus wasn't real. So what do we make of these arguments? Well, I'm actually going to talk about the trustworthiness of the Bible in the second question, so I won't dwell on that now. But what I would say is that even the existence of 4 Gospels would suggest Jesus was a real person. If you take something like Robin Hood, we have all heard of Robin Hood and his merry men dressed in green in Sherwood Forest, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. We have all these stories, and by and large, we don't believe them for good reason. But the reality is, there actually was a real person called Robin Hood. He's very different to what you might find in a Hollywood movie, but over time, the stories we have were legends that grew and were embellished that totally distorted the facts, but at the root of it, there was a real person. So even if the Bible was completely untrustworthy, so even if we couldn't trust the Bible at all, the fact that you had 4 independent people writing about Jesus' life would suggest that there must have been a person at the centre of it for these stories to grow around in the first place. So even if the Bible is untrustworthy, that wouldn't mean that Jesus wasn't a real historical person. What about this idea that their pagan myths were taken and added in to the Christian faith? There's a man whose name is Tom Harper. I think he's Canadian, but he might be American. And he wrote a book called The Pagan Christ, which in 2005 was made into a short TV series on American TV. And in this book, he argues that all the things that Christians believe about Jesus were actually borrowed from Egyptian religions. And they were things that Egyptians had believed for hundreds of years beforehand. And what happened is that the original followers, the original Christians, knew that these were myths, that they weren't true stories. But over time, that was forgotten, and people made the mistake of thinking that there are actual real events. And so we came to believe Jesus was a historical person. And one of the examples he'll give is the Egyptian god Horus. Now he says that the Egyptians believed that Horus was born of a virgin birth. They also used to call him a fisher of men and believed that he travelled with 12 disciples. They also alleged that the Egyptians believed that Horus was betrayed and killed, but then was resurrected from the grave. Now obviously that sounds very similar to Jesus, and if that's true, would be quite a challenge for any Christian believer. But whenever we have something like this, it's very important to go back and look at what historians are able to tell us about what people actually believed about these pagan gods. Because people who have done the research, they've looked into Horus and what the Egyptians actually believed about him, have discovered that they never believed he had a virgin birth. That's not actually true. He didn't travel with 12 disciples. The Egyptians believed he travelled with 4 demigods, which is not only a different number, but it's quite different to travelling with a group of human beings. They never called him a fisher of men, and they didn't believe that he'd been resurrected in the same body he had before he died. So when you examine the claim, it actually doesn't stack up. It's some ideas that have been wrongly attributed to Egyptian religion that historical research proves to be wrong. And actually, if you look at all of these supposed similarities between Christianity and pagan religions, we actually find the same thing, that when you go back to what people actually believed in the past, it isn't quite what some modern skeptics would claim they do believe. And added to that, if you think that Jesus' first disciples were Jews, and Jews were notorious for being very fiercely independent when it came to being a nation and religion, it's very unlikely that these Jews would have adopted ideas from the pagan religions around them. It just wouldn't be something that Jews would do. So the argument that it's all copied from other pagan religions just isn't very historically credible. What about this final argument that he puts forward, that there are no genuine historical writings about Jesus outside of the Bible? Is that true? Well, there are actually a number of ancient writers who did appear to write about Jesus, who were not Christians, and would appear to give confirmation that he was a real historical person. Perhaps the most well-known one is a writer called Josephus. Now Josephus was a Jewish historian, he wasn't a Christian, and he was writing about 93 AD. So that is about 60 years after Jesus would have been crucified. And if you read his works, there's a paragraph in his writings that says this: "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named after him, are not extinct at this day. Now, if you remember, that was written by a man who was not a Christian, so he's got nothing to prove, writing in 93 AD, that would seem to give credible historical evidence that Jesus really was a historical figure. But, and there is a but, many scholars smell a rat, because there are some phrases in there that are very unusual for a Jew who was not a Christian to write. Firstly, the one who says, if it be lawful to call him a man, which kind of implies that Jesus was a bit more than a man, that maybe he was God. That scholars say, well, a Jew who didn't believe in Jesus would never say that. The next one where it says, he was the Christ, which means he was the Jewish Messiah. If a Jew had not followed Jesus, they wouldn't say that either. And also they question whether a Jew who didn't believe in Jesus would write about the resurrection. And so for those reasons, for quite a few years, scholars dismissed that paragraph from Josephus' writings. And they said that it was a forgery. Now, if you think about the ancient world, there were no photocopiers, no printing presses. If you wanted to reproduce a book, you had to copy it out by hand. And so what they suggest is that at some stage after the Roman Empire became Christian, someone was copying out Josephus and they added this paragraph in. And then from that point on, whenever anyone else copied Josephus, they were copying the version with this extra paragraph in, and so it got spread around. And so they would allege the whole thing is a forgery. Now, to be fair to them, it is very unlikely that Josephus wrote those exact words. It's just not the kind of thing you would expect him to write. But what more recent research has shown, and what now most scholars accept, is that while this passage has certainly been fiddled with by a Christian at some point in history, the whole thing is not made up. And using their kind of science of textual criticism, where they compare manuscripts, and all the kind of clever things that researchers can do, they believe that they've reconstructed the original paragraph, what Josephus really wrote. And this is what he really wrote. He says, "There was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and many of Greek origin. When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." So what you find there is that a couple of those things have now been ruled out as not genuine. So saying he was the Messiah, suggesting he might be God, talking about the resurrection, they've all been removed out as not original. But what you're left with is, firstly, a genuine historical account of Jesus outside of the Bible, which would confirm what the Bible seems to say. It also affirms that Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate. So we have another historical source outside of the Bible confirming what the Bible says. And also, he does say he was a doer of startling deeds. And that's quite significant, because that says that someone who's not a Christian, writing outside of the Bible, is also commenting about the fact that Jesus was reported to have performed miracles. And if we think about this, this is 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion. People who do research into how legends and myths occur say it takes much longer than 60 years. It will take 2 or 3 generations. So this idea that some people would argue that all the stories of Jesus' miracles were myths that got added on to him much later in history after the people who originally knew him had died off, that can't be true if in 93 AD a non-Christian Jew was writing that Jesus was reported to have performed miracles. Now, it doesn't prove he did perform miracles, but it does prove that those people who were alive at the time and would have met and seen him believe that he did perform miracles. That is not a myth that was added onto the Jesus stories. And in fact, Josephus is not the only ancient writer who talks about Jesus. There's a Roman historian who also wrote in 109 AD. He confirms that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. His name was Tacitus. There's another Roman writer called Pliny the Younger who mentions Jesus in his writings, which in one hand isn't proof that Jesus existed, but is proof that his name was widely known amongst Romans in the early years of the 2nd century. On top of that, there are many Jewish writings from around the time just after Jesus that are very hostile. Very don't like him, but they do talk about him, and they'll say that he was a sorcerer who misled people. And what you find in all these ancient writings is, whilst there were many people who opposed Christianity, none of them said Jesus didn't exist. Those who didn't like him sought to discredit him. They didn't deny his existence. So what we find is there is actually other evidence outside of the Bible that confirms the things we read in the Bible to be true. Jesus was a real historical figure. And that's why there's a respected history professor, his name's Geoffrey Blainey, and he once said that Jesus' life is astonishingly documented for a person of the time. What he means by that is that there are many ancient historical figures like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, that we accept without question that they were real, but there's actually less evidence to support their existence than there is to support the existence of Jesus. So there's actually very good historical evidence that he was a real person. And another Cambridge scholar, a man called Graham Stanton, he once wrote that today, nearly all historians, whether Christian or not, accept that Jesus existed. So we actually can be very confident that Jesus was a real historical person. That does then lead us to the next question. If he was real, where can we look to get reliable information about his life and what he was like? Now, I think you all know that I work for Bodmin Community Church, so I'm obviously a Christian. So it won't be a surprise to you for me to say that I believe actually the Bible is the best source of reliable historical information about Jesus. And but I have reasons for believing that. I mean, firstly, one thing that is said is that the Gospel accounts in the Bible were written a long time after the events by people who never knew Jesus. Now, I would say that's not true. I would say they were written by eyewitnesses who did know Jesus and were aware of what they were writing to be true. The reason why I would say this is because most scholars now who do research into this area, Christians and non-Christians, will agree that Mark's Gospel was written by 70 AD, which is 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, and that the other 3 Gospels are written shortly after that. So that tells us that they were actually not written a long time afterwards, but they were written within the lifetime of people who would have been eyewitnesses and were around at the time that these things were set down in writing. And so it would have been possible to go to them and check, are these things true? Now you might think, well, 40 years is still a long time, memories could grow hazy, facts could be distorted. But think about it this way. Imagine if you were reading an interview with a veteran from World War I, and that this interview was written in 1974. Now, if you read that veteran's account in 1974, would you dismiss it and say, well, that's totally unreliable, because it was written a long time after World War I can't trust anything that he says? The reality is no. Most people would look at that and see it as a good source of primary history coming from an eyewitness who was actually there. And we'd recognise that was good history. And if it was written in 1974, it would actually be 60 years after the start of the First World War. So an account written 40 years after the events are describing, that gap is actually not that big. It would be no different to you asking your parents about things that happened to them when they were children. We're talking like a similar time span. And if I ask my father questions about his childhood, I don't approach it skeptically, disbelieving the things that he's telling me because I think his memory's faulty. I expect him to have accurate memories, pretty much, of what happened. So firstly, they were written within this short time period, too short for legends or myths to creep into the story, and within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. But then that does then say, well, how do we know that what we have in the Bible today is the same as what was originally written? How do we know it wasn't changed over history? Well, one of the things we have in our favour is that archaeologists have found thousands of copies of the Gospels, or fragments of copies of the Gospels, In fact, at the moment there is nearly 6,000 of these separate different fragments or whole Gospels that they found. And some of these are very early. There's a copy or a fragment, I think one page of John's Gospel, which they've dated the paper it was written on, and it dates back to almost 100 AD. I think Jesus was crucified in 30 AD, so we have a copy very close to the time it would have been originally written. And in 2012, an American academic called Dan Wallace announced that he found a fragment of Mark's Gospel that had been dated to even earlier than 100 AD. So we're now finding fragments of Gospels that are almost old enough to be original documents. And when we compare a modern Bible with what these ancient copies of the Bible have, we actually find that they match to 99% accuracy. So what it means is, if you go into a bookstore today and buy a Bible off the shelf, you can be confident that 99% of the information in that Bible has been accurately kept and transferred through history and is what was originally written. Not that 1% where there is some doubt over its accuracy. It will include things like the last few verses of Mark's Gospel, which some people argue weren't originally part of the Gospel. If that 1% was all removed from the Bible, it wouldn't change a single Christian teaching or belief. It wouldn't, if we took up the end away from Mark's Gospel, it wouldn't even change anything that Mark's Gospel teaches or deny the resurrection, because all those things are still in Mark's Gospel, in the bits we know, confidently can say have been accurately kept in the Bible. So again, we find not only is the Bible written at a very early date, it's been accurately kept and preserved through all of history. So what about the last claim that was made, that what we have in the Bible was the kind of official version that the church chose, and they suppressed all other contrary versions that they didn't like? Well, I expect many of you will have heard of the Gnostic Gospels. They've been spoken about a lot quite recently, particularly since that guy, I've forgotten his name, wrote the Da Vinci Code. What the Gnostic Gospels are, they're a series of ancient books that were discovered by archaeologists in Egypt. They date back to about the year 300, but people think they're copies of earlier manuscripts. And what we find in the Gnostic Gospels is you have accounts of Jesus' life that sometimes are quite different to what you'll read in the New Testament. And so the argument will go is that what you read in the New Testament is almost the victor's version of history. So the people who won the argument, they got their version into the Bible and they suppressed all these other accounts. And some people even argue that the Gnostic Gospels are actually older and more authentic than what we read in the Bible. Well, how does this claim stack up to research? Probably the oldest of the Gnostic Gospels is called the Gospel of Thomas. That's probably the oldest one. Some people say it was written very early, but actually there's good evidence to suggest it's actually written after the New Testament. And the reason why we say that is because it either quotes from or alludes to lots of the New Testament, not just the Gospels, but other parts of the New Testament, other books of the New Testament. And if it's quoting from it, then that implies it must have been written afterwards. And some scholars even go further to say that if you look at some of the quotes in the Gospel of Thomas, they appear to be taken from the Syriac version of the New Testament. Now what that means is this: when the New Testament was originally written, it was written in Greek. About AD 170, a version of the New Testament was translated into the Syriac language. So if the Gospel of Thomas appears to be quoting from the Syriac New Testament, then it means it was written after AD 170. Now if you think about that, we know that Mark's Gospel was written by 70 AD, and the others shortly afterwards. But the earliest Gnostic Gospel was written over 100 years after Mark's Gospel, after all the eyewitnesses would have died. You can't begin to compare them if you want to look in terms of historical value as to which is most likely to be accurate. The New Testament stands much more probability of being a reliable historical source than a book that was written over 100 years later. On top of that, we have other historical evidence that puts paid to this theory of the church choosing its favourite versions. There's a man called Justin Martyr. He was a Christian, and he wrote a letter in about AD 150, and he was writing to the Roman Emperor, and in it he was given a description of what happened in churches across the Roman Empire. And as part of his description, he mentions that it's normal for them to read one of the Gospels, that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke or John, and then someone will effectively give a sermon based on the reading in the Gospel. So they were doing that in churches in 150 AD. And if they're teaching from the Gospels and reading from them, it shows that Christians had accepted them and regarded these as authoritative text. You know, something that is true and that they base their faith on. That was in 150 AD, which was before the earliest Gnostic Gospel was written. So it wasn't a case that there were lots of different Gospels around and they chose the ones they preferred. They already had accepted Gospels in the church, and then these other ideas came in to kind of muddy the water. So what happened when they set the canon of the New Testament and they decided which books will be an official part of the Bible was, they actually weeded out the later editions that came in that were spurious and contradicted what they'd already been accepted amongst the church as the official account of Jesus' life. So this idea of there's been some kind of cover-up just isn't what history tells us. History tells us is that the Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, New Testament, were always the accepted accounts of Jesus' life. The Gnostic Gospels were much later things that came in that confused people for a while and were eventually weeded out for what they were, which is untrustworthy accounts of Jesus' life. So what we find then, just to re-summarise what I'm telling you, we can be very confident Jesus was a real historical person. There isn't much doubt. There will be many people who argue that he wasn't, but most scholars working in the field would say he was, and the evidence supports that. If we want to know about Jesus, the New Testament is actually a very reliable document to work from. It was written close to the time. It shows signs of being written by eyewitnesses. There are good reasons to believe its accuracy. And it's much more trustworthy than any other later account of Jesus' life. So if you want to know what Jesus, who he was, what he taught, and what he did, the actual place to look would be in the Bible. So to really answer the question, I'd say Jesus wasn't a myth. He was a real historical person. And if we want to know about his life and what he did, what he claimed about himself, we need to look in the New Testament. That's the most reliable place to look. Well, what we're going to do now is slightly different from what we've done previously. We're going to, rather than have one person at a time ask me questions, we're going to have discussions on your own individual tables. And on each table, a person's been nominated to chair the discussion. They do have some questions which could be used, but there's no agenda. If you've got something else you want to say, maybe there's a question you might have after some of the things I've said. Maybe you might disagree with something I said and you might want to put forward your point of view, then by all means feel free to do that. But also there are a few sort of questions that might start the conversation. So just, for as long as you want to read, I suggest you discuss this on your tables. Just to let you know, there are some things, if you would like to find out more about Jesus from an authoritative source, we do have free copies of Mark's Gospel, which is the oldest Gospel written, and they are over here on this pillar, so you can pick one up on the way out. They're absolutely free. We also have a little booklet here that has lots of questions in that people often have about the Christian faith, including how do we know we can trust the Bible, and these are also free. You can pick one of these up on your way out, and they're on the pillar over there. And one last thing, if anyone really wants to do some research, these are two books I found very helpful in preparing this talk. So if you come see me afterwards, I'm afraid I can't give them to you, but I can certainly let you copy down the details. So if you wanted to do some independent research your own, these would be two very good places to start. So I'll leave you to your own discussions, and if you want, I'll be floating around. So if you want to call me over for clarification or anything, I'll be more than happy to do that. So thank you for listening.